Canada is working to expand trade with Mexico as the two countries sign a trade memorandum of understanding, and a large Canadian business delegation visits Mexico. So what's the way ahead for trade ties between the two countries, even as the CUSMA trade agreement comes up for renegotiation?
410 billion United States dollars in potential trade diversion, up to 1,500,000 American jobs exposed over the next decade, and 56 billion Canadian dollars in accelerating Canada-Mexico commerce in 2024 alone. This is not a routine adjustment inside the trade war. It is a structural realignment of North America driven by tariffs and reshaping the position of the United States. Canada and Mexico are moving beyond diplomatic coordination. They are engineering redundancy. Two-way merchandise trade between the two countries is projected to exceed 75 billion Canadian dollars by 2027. More than 370 Canadian delegates and over 200 firms recently mobilized across Mexican industrial hubs in the largest bilateral trade mission on record. The most consequential figure tied to this shift has not yet been openly presented in Washington. It reflects projected losses across automotive manufacturing, aluminum, agriculture, port logistics, and critical mineral supply chains, with employment exposure reaching levels typically associated with severe downturns. Listen to the very end. Today, I will reveal the number described by insiders as unprecedented and potentially devastating, a projection that, until now, has never been fully disclosed in the context of this trade war. Inside the current trade war environment, the United States is not simply losing marginal contracts. Scenario modeling conducted by continental trade economists suggests that under sustained tariffs and policy volatility, cumulative supply chain diversion away from United States-dependent channels could reach between 300 billion and 400 billion United States dollars by the mid-2030s. That figure is not a headline exaggeration. It reflects layered exposure across automotive assembly, aluminum processing, agricultural exports, rail freight, and port logistics. Start with manufacturing capital flows. In the 18 months following renewed tariff escalation, multiple cross-border manufacturers publicly signaled delays or reallocations of planned expansion inside the United States. While official investment totals fluctuate year to year, private sector tracking of announced advanced manufacturing commitments shows a pronounced shift toward Mexico in sectors tied to electric vehicles and heavy industry. Mexico has reported record levels of pledged foreign direct investment in manufacturing corridors, with several industrial regions operating at near full capacity. Meanwhile, United States auto exports to Canada have shown measurable contraction during periods of heightened tariff uncertainty. Even modest substitution patterns create outsized ripple effects. If Canada were to replace just 10% of certain United States vehicle imports with Mexican assembly over a sustained 5-year window, the cumulative export displacement would reach tens of billions of United States dollars. Electric vehicle production amplifies the vulnerability. Mexico's projected annual electric vehicle output, originally estimated in the low hundreds of thousands, has been revised upward under aggressive nearshoring scenarios. If assembly volumes approach 700,000 to 800,000 units annually by the end of the decade, and a significant share of battery inputs and green aluminum is sourced from Canada rather than the United States, upstream American suppliers face revenue compression measured in the tens of billions each year. Aluminum illustrates the pressure point clearly. Canada produces hydroelectric-powered aluminum with among the lowest carbon intensity globally. As procurement standards evolve, manufacturers seeking lower embedded emissions are increasingly evaluating Canadian supply. If Mexico were to commit even 1/3 of its expanding infrastructure and electric vehicle-grade aluminum demand to Canadian producers, modeling scenarios indicate potential annual revenue exposure for certain United States smelters in excess of 10 billion United States dollars. Agriculture compounds the impact. Mexico remains one of the largest buyers of United States grain. However, diversification strategies under the broader trade war environment have encouraged exploration of alternative sourcing channels. A shift of even a small single-digit percentage of grain imports toward Canadian suppliers represents billions in annual export exposure for American farmers. Those billions translate directly into land values, credit availability, equipment financing, and rural tax bases. Ports feel the shock before headlines do. If north-south container flows between Canada and Mexico expand while bypassing United States intermediary hubs, cumulative revenue exposure for major American port complexes over a decade could reach several tens of billions of United States dollars when accounting for warehousing, rail transfer, and downstream distribution services. Port employment, often union-concentrated and politically sensitive, becomes directly exposed to structural diversion. The deeper consequence is not only lost revenue, it is loss of indispensability. For decades, the United States anchored North American trade architecture because scale and reliability were assumed constants. The trade war altered the reliability variable. Once corporations begin modeling the United States as a volatility node rather than a stable hub, the cost of capital adjusts accordingly. Borrowing costs incorporate uncertainty. Insurance premiums rise. Procurement contracts include risk hedges. Capital flows respond mathematically, not emotionally. If current tariffs remain a recurring feature of policy, the cumulative employment exposure across automotive, metals, agriculture, freight, and logistics sectors could approach 1 million positions over a long horizon under aggressive diversion scenarios. That is not a forecast of immediate collapse. It is a projection of structural drift. And structural drift is harder to reverse than cyclical downturn. What emerges from internal continental planning discussions is a pattern few voters have fully seen. Canada consolidating its role as resource anchor, Mexico accelerating as manufacturing engine, and the United States gradually transitioning from indispensable center to optional participant in certain supply chains. The next phase of this analysis examines the strategic miscalculation that may have triggered this acceleration, and the internal assessment circulating among policy advisors suggests that the tipping point may already have passed, though almost no one in Washington has publicly acknowledged it. The most dangerous miscalculation in the trade war was not economic. It was psychological. For decades, the United States operated under a structural assumption. Its market size guaranteed permanent leverage. With nearly 1/4 of global output and the largest consumer base in North America, Washington believed Canada and Mexico would always orbit around American demand, American transit corridors, and American regulatory systems. That assumption is now under stress. Inside confidential trade simulations conducted by continental advisory groups, a scenario repeatedly examined involves partial rerouting of just 35% of previously United States dependent supply chains into direct Canada-Mexico channels or diversified global routes. Under that model, cumulative United States export displacement could approach 320 billion United States dollars by the early 2030s. The exposure would not be evenly distributed. Automotive remains the largest pressure point. If Mexico's electric vehicle production capacity scales toward 800,000 units annually by the end of the decade, and even half of those vehicles integrate Canadian batteries and green aluminum rather than United States processed components, upstream American suppliers could face sustained annual revenue compression exceeding 25 billion United States dollars. That is before accounting for secondary services, design, engineering, specialized tooling, transport insurance, and rail freight. Steel and aluminum amplify the risk. If Canadian low-carbon aluminum captures a growing share of Mexico's infrastructure and vehicle-grade demand, United States smelters could experience multi-year contract erosion. Some modeling exercises estimate potential annual exposure between 12 billion and 18 billion United States dollars under aggressive substitution patterns. Steel intermediates show similar vulnerability if semi-finished inputs flow directly from Canada into Mexican manufacturing without routing through United States processors. Agriculture introduces political sensitivity. Mexico has historically been one of the largest foreign markets for United States corn and soybeans. A substitution shift of 10% in key grain categories toward Canadian suppliers would translate into billions in annual lost farm revenue. That contraction would ripple through equipment manufacturers, fertilizer suppliers, rural banks, and county tax bases across the Midwest. Energy compounds the structural shift. Canada's position as a dominant producer of uranium, hydroelectric power, potash, and critical battery minerals gives it leverage in emerging clean technology supply chains. Mexico's grid modernization and industrial expansion increasingly look north for secure, lower volatility partnerships. If joint Canada-Mexico energy and mineral agreements reduce reliance on United States transit choke points, long-term American energy-linked revenue exposure could climb into the tens of billions over 15 years. The central issue is not hostility, it is reliability. In capital markets, size matters. But reliability prices higher. During periods of heightened tariff volatility, risk premiums on United States-centric manufacturing bonds have widened relative to comparable Canadian issuances. Procurement departments within multinational firms increasingly categorize certain United States-dependent supply corridors as higher uncertainty pathways. That classification alone alters multi-year investment allocation. Once redundancy is built, dependence weakens. Once dependence weakens, tariffs lose leverage. The trade war was intended to strengthen negotiating power for the United States. Instead, it has accelerated contingency planning among its closest neighbors. Canada and Mexico are not withdrawing from American markets. They are reducing structural vulnerability to policy swings. If current trajectories persist, continental trade by the mid-2030s may no longer revolve automatically around Washington. The United States would remain large. It would remain wealthy. But it would no longer be indispensable in every major supply chain category. And in geopolitics, indispensability is influence. There is a point in every prolonged trade war when policy shifts stop being tactical and become structural. North America may be approaching that point now. According to long-range continental modeling scenarios discussed among trade economists, sustained tariffs combined with supply chain volatility could redirect between $350 billion and $410 billion United States dollars in cumulative trade value away from United States-dependent processing and transit systems by the mid-2030s. That figure aggregates automotive components, critical minerals, green metals, agriculture, freight logistics, and energy transit. 410 billion United States dollars is not cyclical fluctuation. It is generational reallocation. Consider the logistics backbone first. If Mexico secures expanded routing capacity through Canadian Pacific ports such as Vancouver and Prince Rupert, and if north-south rail corridors are upgraded to support higher container throughput, diversion from traditional United States east-west intermediary channels could accelerate sharply. Independent maritime assessments suggest that even a partial realignment of container flows could expose United States port ecosystems to cumulative revenue losses measured in the tens of billions over a decade when factoring warehousing, rail transfer, customs brokerage, and distribution. Ports are not isolated facilities. They anchor regional employment clusters. When throughput shifts, entire coastal labor markets feel the impact. Automotive restructuring multiplies the effect. By 2030, Mexico's electric vehicle manufacturing corridor could approach or exceed 800,000 units annually under aggressive investment scenarios. If 60% of those vehicles integrate Canadian battery inputs and low-carbon aluminum rather than United States processed materials, upstream American suppliers could face annual revenue compression surpassing 35 billion United States dollars over a 10-year horizon that compounds into hundreds of billions in displaced industrial value. Steel and aluminum production centers in politically sensitive regions would experience concentrated pressure. Even modest contract erosion can trigger plant downsizing in high fixed cost industries. Agriculture reinforces the exposure. If Canada expands cereal and oilseed penetration into Mexican markets by 15% above baseline growth, and if substitution continues in selected meat and specialty crop segments, United States farm revenue exposure could exceed 12 billion United States dollars annually under sustained trade war conditions. Rural credit systems, equipment manufacturers, and commodity hedging markets would absorb secondary shocks. Energy and minerals deepen the transformation. Canada's reserves of lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, uranium, and potash are central to the next industrial cycle. Mexico's manufacturing expansion requires secure supply of those materials. If long-term integration agreements reduce reliance on United States processing infrastructure, American transit revenue and refining margins could experience cumulative erosion approaching 40 billion to 50 billion United States dollars over extended horizons. The pattern is consistent. Canada consolidates as resource anchor. Mexico accelerates as manufacturing engine. The United States remains large, but less central. The psychological dimension may be the most consequential. For decades, access to the United States market was considered indispensable. Now, redundancy is being engineered deliberately. Once Canada and Mexico demonstrate that supply chains can function efficiently without routing through American choke points vulnerable to tariffs, bargaining leverage weakens. Size without predictability becomes liability. Employment exposure compounds the concern. Under aggressive diversion scenarios examined by continental analysts, cumulative United States job risk across automotive, metals, agriculture, ports, and freight logistics could approach or exceed 1.5 million positions over a 15-year period. These figures represent structural drift rather than immediate collapse, but structural drift reshapes regional economies permanently. History rarely announces turning points loudly. It signals them through data, freight volumes, capital allocation, mineral flows, and contract renewals. The United States is not being excluded by decree. It is being bypassed through design. The final question now confronting policymakers in Washington is not whether the trade war triggered adjustments. It is whether those adjustments have crossed a threshold beyond which reversal becomes economically prohibitive. The central question is no longer whether the trade war triggered diversification. The question is whether the United States can still reclaim structural centrality before redundancy becomes permanent. Because once supply chains harden, they rarely unwind. Inside long horizon continental modeling exercises, one scenario stands out. If Canada and Mexico successfully consolidate even 40% of high-value manufacturing integration along a direct north-south axis by the early 2040s, cumulative United States export displacement across automotive, green metals, agriculture, logistics, and energy processing could exceed 500 billion United States dollars over a 15 to 20-year window. 500 billion United States dollars. That level of industrial drift does not manifest overnight. It compounds quietly through contract renewals, factory siting decisions, procurement algorithms, and financing terms. The most dangerous phase is not collapse. It is gradual normalization. Capital markets already respond to policy stability signals. During periods of elevated tariff rhetoric, multinational firms increase scenario hedging and diversify sourcing footprints. Insurance costs rise for politically sensitive corridors. Long-term fixed asset commitments shift toward jurisdictions perceived as predictable. Predictability has become a competitive advantage. Canada is positioning itself as the stable resource backbone of North American clean manufacturing. Mexico is positioning itself as the scalable industrial platform benefiting from nearshoring and diversified global demand. The United States remains the largest consumer market in the hemisphere, but consumer size alone does not guarantee supply chain centrality if reliability concerns persist inside the trade war environment. Consider the automotive sector again. If Mexico reaches sustained production near 800,000 electric vehicles annually by the early 2030s and integrates Canadian battery minerals and aluminum at scale, upstream United States component suppliers risk structural market share loss. Even a 15% permanent substitution away from American inputs would represent tens of billions of United States dollars annually in foregone revenue. Aluminum and steel remain vulnerable. If carbon pricing frameworks expand globally and procurement standards tighten, low-carbon Canadian aluminum may command preferential access in Mexican and international contracts. United States smelters operating under higher fossil fuel intensity grids face margin compression. Multi-year margin compression leads to capacity rationalization. Capacity rationalization leads to job displacement. Agriculture carries parallel exposure. If Mexican import diversification strategies reduce reliance on United States grain by modest but sustained percentages, cumulative farm income loss could reshape land valuations and rural credit structures across the Midwest over time. The impact would not be evenly distributed. It would concentrate geographically. Energy transit adds another dimension. If long-term Canada-Mexico mineral and energy integration bypasses United States choke points through expanded Pacific corridors and rail capacity upgrades, American transit fee revenue and midstream margins decline gradually. Once alternative corridors prove reliable, reversing traffic patterns becomes costly. The United States retains enormous structural strengths: scale, innovation, ecosystems, capital markets depth, and consumer demand. The decisive variable is policy credibility. If tariffs continue to function as recurring instruments inside the trade war without multilateral coordination, volatility premiums will remain embedded in corporate planning models. If stability is restored and predictability institutionalized, capital could recalibrate. The window for recalibration may not remain open indefinitely, because the longer Canada and Mexico deepen industrial integration, the more self-sustaining the system becomes. Battery plants anchor mineral supply contracts, assembly plants anchor component ecosystems, ports anchor rail expansion anchors warehousing investment, each layer reinforces the next. Structural momentum is difficult to reverse once entrenched. The defining issue now confronting the United States is not whether it remains powerful, it is whether it remains indispensable in North America. If the current trajectory continues unchecked, this decade may be remembered not simply as a chapter in the trade war, but as the period when continental gravity quietly shifted and when tariffs intended to consolidate influence accelerated diversification instead. In the final analysis, we return to the core question facing American policymakers and voters alike. Is this a bold strategy that will ultimately restore leverage to the United States, or a risky miscalculation that allowed Canada and Mexico to build a parallel economic axis while Washington focused on short-term tactical advantage? Thanks for watching.